What happens when the annual ritual meant to bring a nation together becomes the moment that reveals how deeply it is fractured? When does a constitutional tradition transform from unifying ceremony into what critics call political theater disconnected from reality? And can a speech designed to address the State of the Union serve its purpose when a significant portion of the legislature refuses to be in the room because they believe what they'll hear will be fundamentally dishonest? These are not theoretical questions. On Tuesday, February 24th, 2026, President Donald Trump will deliver his first official State of the Union address of his second term to a joint session of Congress. But at least 12 Democratic members of Congress have announced they will not be present in the chamber. Instead, they will be on the National Mall, less than a mile away, participating in a counter-event designed to provide what organizers are calling an alternative vision for the nation's future, one grounded in what they describe as actual facts rather than political spin. The boycott represents more than a simple absence. It reflects not just partisan division, but a fundamental breakdown in trust between elected officials and a president whose relationship with truth has been, to put it charitably, complicated throughout his political career. It raises questions about how democracy functions when its participants no longer share basic assumptions about whether the person at the podium can be believed, whether his statistics reflect reality, or whether his promises have any connection to his actual intentions. The event these lawmakers will attend instead is called the People's State of the Union. Scheduled to begin at 8:30 p.m. Eastern Time, 30 minutes before the president's speech, the rally is being organized by progressive advocacy group Move On Civic Action and Midas Touch, a progressive media company. The event will take place near the Capitol on the National Mall and is explicitly framed as counter-programming to what organizers describe as President Trump's night full of lies and misplaced priorities for the American people. The use of the word lies is deliberate and pointed. During Trump's previous State of the Union addresses, fact-checkers from organizations across the political spectrum documented dozens of false or misleading statements. In his 2020 State of the Union, for instance, fact-checkers identified more than 30 statements that range from exaggerations to outright falsehoods, including claims about economic growth that contradicted government statistics, assertions about healthcare policy that misstated the effects of his administration's actions, and statements about his political opponents that had no basis in reality. According to the organizers, the lawmakers planning to skip the president's address and attend the rally instead include 5 United States senators: Ed Markey of Massachusetts, Jeff Merkley of Oregon, Chris Murphy of Connecticut, Tina Smith of Minnesota, and Chris Van Hollen of Maryland. 7 members of the House of Representatives have also committed to attending: Yasemin Ansari of Arizona, Becca Balint of Vermont, Greg Casar of Texas, Veronica Escobar of Texas, Pramila Jayapal of Washington, Delia Ramirez of Illinois, and Bonnie Watson-Coleman of New Jersey. The rally will feature these lawmakers speaking alongside what organizers call everyday Americans most impacted by Trump's dangerous agenda, a characterization Trump's defenders would dispute, but one that reflects genuine concerns about policies that have separated families through immigration enforcement, eliminated health care coverage for vulnerable populations, and exacerbated economic inequality. The planned participants include federal workers who have lost their jobs not because of performance issues or budget constraints, but because of loyalty tests and ideological purges. They include immigrants who have faced detention or deportation despite having legal status to be in the United States. They include families struggling with health care and housing costs that have risen under policies Trump claims have made Americans more prosperous. Senator Chris Murphy has been particularly vocal about his reasons for boycotting the president's address. In statements to the New York Times, Murphy said Trump has made a mockery of the State of the Union speech and he doesn't deserve an audience. This is not hyperbole. From Murphy's perspective, it reflects his experience sitting through previous Trump addresses, where the president used the solemn occasion to attack political opponents by name, to make claims that were demonstrably false, and to turn what is supposed to be a sober assessment of national challenges into what Murphy characterizes as a partisan rally. Murphy explained his decision in stark terms, stating that Trump will tell 40 different lies, call Democrats names, paper over his corruption, and that the senator does not feel the president's approach dignifies having Democrats there to cloak the speech in a veneer of respectability. The number 40 is Murphy's estimate based on patterns from previous addresses. Independent fact-checking organizations have documented similar or higher numbers of false statements in Trump's past State of the Union speeches, lending credibility to Murphy's prediction. Murphy characterized Trump's address as taking a moment that is meant to bring the country together and turning it into a campaign rally to spew hatred and division. This assessment is supported by analysis of Trump's rhetorical style in previous State of the Union addresses, which have included direct attacks on named individuals, mockery of political opponents, and appeals to base partisan sentiment that are highly unusual for what is traditionally a more elevated and unifying occasion. Senator Chris Van Hollen echoed these sentiments on social media, writing on X, "Next week, Trump will deliver his State of the Union address. I won't be there. Trump is marching America towards fascism, and I refuse to normalize his shredding of our Constitution and democracy. This cannot be business as usual." Van Hollen's use of the word fascism reflects genuine alarm among constitutional scholars and democracy experts about patterns they've observed in Trump's governance: the vilification of the press, the attempts to use law enforcement and justice system as tools against political opponents, the refusal to accept electoral defeats, the encouragement of violence against critics, and the systematic undermining of democratic institutions when they constrain his power. Senator Ed Markey framed his participation in the alternative event as an assertion that political power belongs to the people rather than to any individual leader, a pointed reference to Trump's apparent belief that the presidency grants him personal authority rather than public trust. In his statement explaining his decision, Markey said, "The State of the Union should be a reckoning with reality, but Donald Trump will use it to spin fiction and normalize the gross abuse of power." The phrase abuse of power is not casual rhetoric. It refers to documented instances where Trump has used the presidency to benefit himself financially, to protect allies from legal consequences, and to punish those he perceives as disloyal. Representative Becca Balin stated that instead of sitting through what has become President Trump's annual self-congratulation, misinformation, and division speech, she looks forward to standing with colleagues, organizers, advocates, and everyday Americans who are committed to doing the real and honest work of protecting our rights and strengthening our democracy. The word misinformation is particularly significant in this context. Unlike the softer term inaccuracy or exaggeration, misinformation suggests deliberate intent to deceive, an accusation that Balin and her colleagues appear willing to level based on the consistent pattern of false statements across Trump's public communications. Sarah Hagdusty, chief of programs at Move On Civic Action, told reporters that the organization knows Trump is going to use the State of the Union to mislead the American people and lie. The confidence in this prediction is based on observable patterns. Tracking databases maintained by major news organizations have documented thousands of false or misleading claims made by Trump during his time in public office. The expectation that the State of the Union will follow this pattern is not speculation, it is an evidence-based prediction. The decision to organize this boycott and counter event does have some historical precedent, though the scale and coordination of this particular effort are notable. During Trump's previous State of the Union addresses, Democratic lawmakers engaged in various forms of protest. In 2020, during Trump's final State of the Union of his first term, then House Speaker Nancy Pelosi famously tore up her copy of the president's speech as she stood behind him on the dais. The act was widely criticized by Republicans as disrespectful, but Pelosi defended it as an appropriate response to what she called a speech full of falsehoods delivered by a president she said had violated his oath of office, a reference to Trump's impeachment just weeks earlier. During Trump's 2025 joint address to Congress, Representative Al Green of Texas was removed from the House chamber by the Sergeant-at-Arms after he jeered at the president, an outburst that reflected frustration after Trump spent several minutes of his speech mocking Senator Elizabeth Warren using a derogatory nickname he had employed throughout his first term. Numerous Democrats walked out in protest. Several Democratic members of Congress boycotted that address altogether, and those who did attend held up signs calling Trump king and liar, accusations that, while provocative, reflect genuine concerns about Trump's authoritarian tendencies and his troubled relationship with factual accuracy. These past protests were largely spontaneous or individual acts of resistance. What distinguishes the current boycott is its organized nature, its coordination with advocacy groups and media organizations, and its explicit goal of creating an alternative narrative that will compete for public attention at the exact moment the president is speaking. The organizers are not simply encouraging lawmakers to stay home in silent protest. They are creating a visible, televised counter-event designed to draw attention away from what they characterize as propaganda and toward what they believe is a more honest assessment of the nation's challenges. Not all Democratic lawmakers are participating in the boycott, and their reasons for attending provide insight into the difficult calculations opposition party members face when dealing with a president they fundamentally distrust. House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries, the highest-ranking Democrat in the House of Representatives, told reporters on Wednesday that his current plan is to attend. Jeffries articulated his reasoning in terms that emphasized territorial claim rather than respect for the office. "We're not going to Donald Trump's house. He's coming to our house. It's my view that you don't let anyone ever run you off of your block." This framing is telling. Jeffries is not attending because he respects Trump or believes the speech will be truthful or constructive. He is attending because he refuses to cede physical space in the Capitol to someone he views as an interloper despite Trump's constitutional authority to be there. Jeffries has advised members of his caucus that they face essentially two acceptable approaches: They can attend and display what he called silent defiance, or they can participate in different alternate programming that is going to take place in and around the Capitol complex. What Jeffries has discouraged, according to reports, is creating disruptions during the speech itself, a position that reflects concern about optics and political fallout rather than any belief that Trump deserves respectful silence. His guidance appears designed to prevent Republicans from characterizing Democrats as disrespectful of democratic institutions, even as those same Democrats believe Trump himself is the primary threat to those institutions. Representative Jared Huffman told Axios last week that he plans to attend the speech, but expects to walk out at some point. The only question for me is which of his disgusting lines prompts me to get up and leave, because at some point I will, Huffman stated. The certainty that Trump will say something disgusting is not speculation. It's based on a documented history of inflammatory rhetoric, personal attacks, and statements that many Americans find morally offensive. The boycott and counter event are taking place against a backdrop of unusual political circumstances. At the time of the State of the Union address, the federal government will be experiencing a partial shutdown, the second such shutdown in Trump's second term, and yet another example of his administration's apparent inability or unwillingness to engage in the basic work of governing through normal legislative processes. The Department of Homeland Security has been without full funding for nearly a week as the White House and Democrats attempt to negotiate an agreement on reforms to immigration and customs enforcement operations. According to reports, the primary dispute centers on Democratic demands for basic accountability measures, requirements that ICE agents wear body cameras during enforcement actions, that they obtain judicial warrants before certain types of arrests, and that immigration enforcement personnel not be present at polling places during elections. These demands arise from documented incidents where immigration enforcement actions have violated the rights of individuals, including American citizens mistakenly detained or arrested. They reflect concerns about potential voter intimidation if uniformed federal agents are present near voting locations, concerns grounded in Trump's history of making false claims about voter fraud and his documented attempts to interfere with election administration. The Trump administration has characterized these basic accountability measures as non-starters, suggesting an administration more interested in unconstrained power than in protecting civil liberties. The State of the Union address is a constitutional obligation, but the manner of its delivery is not. For most of American history, presidents fulfilled the requirement through written messages. The practice of delivering it as a televised speech has transformed it into political theater where style often overwhelms substance and where presidential image-making can obscure uncomfortable truths about the actual State of the Union. Trump has proven particularly adept at using media spectacle to shape narratives and distract from inconvenient facts. His State of the Union addresses have featured carefully staged moments designed for television, surprise recognitions of selected citizens whose stories align with his political message, dramatic reveals of policy initiatives that often fail to materialize, and carefully crafted applause lines that his supporters will share on social media. What these addresses have not featured, according to fact-checkers and policy analysts, is accurate information about the nation's challenges or honest accounting of his administration's performance. The decision by Democratic lawmakers to abandon the traditional approach of respectful attendance represents a judgment that normal political protocols are inadequate when facing a president who has demonstrated consistent disregard for truth, democratic norms, and institutional constraints. These lawmakers have concluded that the harm of appearing to legitimize what they view as dangerous propaganda outweighs the value of maintaining institutional norms of respect and attendance. This decision has drawn criticism from Republicans who argue that boycotting shows disrespect for the presidency, but this criticism rings hollow coming from a party that spent 8 years questioning whether President Barack Obama was actually born in the United States, a conspiracy theory Trump himself championed, and that refused even to hold hearings on Obama's Supreme Court nominee. The Republican position on institutional respect appears situational at best. The fundamental disagreement underlying these competing positions is about the nature of the current political moment, but it is also about something more basic, whether Trump can be trusted to tell the truth. This is not a question of political spin or selective emphasis. It is a question of whether the president's statements bear any relationship to observable reality. Fact-checking organizations, mainstream media outlets, government watchdogs, and even officials within Trump's own administration have documented thousands of false statements. The pattern is clear and well established. The question is how opposition party members should respond. Those who believe the boycott is justified argue that preserving democratic norms sometimes requires refusing to participate in their violation. They contend that attending a speech they have every reason to believe will be filled with demonstrable falsehoods would make them complicit in the spread of misinformation. They argue that maintaining a facade of normalcy in the face of what they consider authoritarian behavior is itself a betrayal of democratic principles. The planned counter-event, the People's State of the Union, represents an attempt to provide what organizers believe will be a more honest assessment of the nation's challenges by featuring Americans whose lives have been negatively affected by Trump administration policies, families separated by immigration enforcement, workers who lost health care coverage, communities devastated by environmental rollbacks. The organizers aim to ground their political opposition in human stories that reflect actual consequences of policy choices. Whether this approach will prove effective in reaching audiences beyond those already opposed to Trump remains uncertain. In an era of fragmented media consumption and partisan information silos, many Americans will watch Trump's address without ever being exposed to the counter-event or the fact-checking that will inevitably follow. Trump's supporters will likely dismiss the boycott as partisan theater, just as they dismiss fact-checking as biased and criticism as politically motivated. But for the lawmakers participating in the boycott and for the citizens they represent, the question is not whether they can change the minds of Trump's base. The question is whether they can maintain their own integrity while operating in a political environment that rewards dishonesty, where a president can lie repeatedly without consequence, and where opposition is characterized as disloyalty rather than democratic responsibility. The boycott and counter-event are symptoms of a democracy in crisis, a crisis not of partisan disagreement over policy, but of fundamental breakdown in the shared reality necessary for democratic deliberation. When citizens cannot agree on basic facts, when a president's statements cannot be trusted, when institutional norms have been so thoroughly violated that traditional forms of opposition seem inadequate, democracy itself is at risk. What happens on Tuesday night will be watched closely, not just by Americans, but by observers around the world who view the United States as either a model or a warning for their own democracies. The spectacle of a divided legislature with some members in the chamber listening to a president many consider untrustworthy and others staging a competing event will send a message about American democracy. That message is not encouraging. The Constitution requires the president to give Congress information about the State of the Union. It does not require that information to be truthful, though one might reasonably assume the framers expected basic honesty from those holding the nation's highest office. On February 24th, at least 12 members of Congress will exercise their right to be elsewhere, to refuse to provide an audience for what they believe will be a performance disconnected from reality. The rest of the nation will have to decide which version deserves attention: the carefully staged spectacle from a president with a documented history of dishonesty, or the counter-narrative from those who believe democracy requires something more than applauding lies delivered with confidence. The State of the Union may be troubled, but perhaps even more troubling is that Americans can no longer agree on what that state actually is, or whether the person constitutionally obligated to describe it can be trusted to tell the truth.